And we are live. This was kind of an impromptu thing that was occasioned by the fact that Dinesh D'Souza has his head stuck up his ass once again, and I really can't avoid commenting on it because it was so interesting. And I brought another person who admires D'Souza about as much as I do, Jackson. And I'm luring you into a discussion of Margaret Sanger, eugenics, and Hitler. Subjects that are fun to have on a Saturday afternoon. Hi, Jackson.
Hey, how you doing?
Muddle along here. I put a link up for anybody on this, and they can do their own daisy chain trail. But it all relates to a post that D'Souza put up, which is basically an excerpt from his new book, The Big Lie, where he's going after Democrats and all the nasty people that don't like Donald Trump who are insisting that there's something other than conservative politics. Anyway, it's an exclusive at Breitbart, D'Souza, the Hitler-Sanger connection. And Margaret Sanger, if you're familiar, the avatar of Planned Parenthood, has been one of the absolute voodoo pin dolls of culture camp conservatism for a long time, and there's a tendency to try to demonize her position and misrepresent her position. There are all sorts of little landmines that lie around in her worldview, particularly her relationship to eugenics, and that stuff Dinesh feeds off. But because Dinesh is a parasitical scholar, as we have explored before, he really overplays his hand and reveals the problems that he gets into. Look up some of his footnotes, because he had only 6 footnotes in the bloody little thing. And the first one was right at the start of his little section where he quotes from more children from the fit, less from the unfit. That is the chief issue of birth control. Immediately piqued my curiosity, because when you look at his footnote, it was from Richard Weichert's book, From Darwin to Hitler, and Weichert is a big opponent of Darwinism and evolution. He's in with the Discovery Institute set and all that. He has his own little hobby horses to do. But the problem is that Weichert quoted it secondarily from another book from the 1990s. And when I tried to track down the quote, it turns out it's not a Margaret Sanger quote. It was a misunderstanding from something that was put up commentary on her thing. So it's a fictitious quote that Dinesh was drawing off of Weichert, drawing off of somebody else who presumably was before the time when they realized that this wasn't actually a Margaret Sanger quote. Oh, we're off on the right foot already, aren't we? So he then goes on Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, as an ignoble legacy, as a racist who addressed the Ku Klux Klan and initiated a Negro Project. This is all canards that are misrepresentations of, and how she was trying to bring a reasonable out of wackaloon people at the time, including some of the wackaloons in her own ballpark and a few wackaloon ideas of her own. We get down to the third paragraph where sterilization issue. 1932 article, Sanger called for women to be segregated from the larger community onto, quote, farms and homesteads, where they would be, quote, taught to work under competent instructors. And all of this sounds terribly horrifying until you track down the source he used. And when you actually read the source, it's not that it's totally uncreepy, but she was talking basically about extreme, in the terms of the time, mental defectives. And although she threw in epileptics, which makes you go, whoa, okay, well, they didn't quite know how epilepsy worked in those days. But she wasn't talking about women in general, or just any old women. And it was some argument to get into for Dinesh, because in the course of this discussion, where she started off talking about Herbert Hoover and a lot of other things, this was now in the depths of the Depression, she also made a comment about immigration that, apart from its sounding way too well written, really similar to Donald Trump's position, which is that immigration from all of the best places and the right people should be encouraged, but the places that you really haven't been able to assimilate well, those should be discouraged. So this thing could have gone over really well as a speech to Donald Trump supporters, but I don't think Dinesh was reading far enough down to realize that that's part of that connection. And that's what bothered me so much about Dinesh, is that he doesn't see where, yeah, ideas led to all sorts of bad things in many odd ways, but they weren't just restricted to the people Dinesh wants them to be. And as we continued on farther down the road in this little piece, to look at his next, hanging up Paul Popenoe, who was one of Sanger's colleagues, according to Dinesh. The California Progressive called for, quote, lethal chambers, unquote, so that large numbers of, quote, unfit, unquote, people could be systematically lined up and killed. And unfortunately, he cited the primary source on this, which was Popenoe and Johnson's 1918 book, which, to my amazement, is available open text as a PDF online at the Gutenberg Project. So I downloaded the whole bloody thing and discovered, the page 180 did not make such a claim. It turned out he had discussed lethal chamber, singular, on the road on page 184, but it wasn't to recommend it. It was to say that this was a bad idea. And it all related to the idea that was knocking around when they started using gas chambers to kill off people instead of electric chairs, that there was a big controversy over how extensively you should use this. So Popenoe had a lot of weird ideas, to be true, but this was not explicitly one of them. He explicitly did not recommend gas chambers for the unfit, which was precisely the point that Dinesh was accusing him of. And once again, I wasn't reading the damn book. It's a very long and diatribe-y kind of euthanasia or a eugenics argument, which you have to remember how popular eugenics was back in the time when nobody knew anything about genetics. And a lot of people, including Bernard Shaw and President Teddy Roosevelt, and along with Margaret Sanger, and frankly, some people in the creationist movement, which I've spotted over the years, were lured in with this idea of better through proper breeding, where the right people bred and the bad people didn't, and maybe you should get rid of them too. And that ultimately reached its horrifying conclusion with the Nazis. Well, another reason why Dinesh should avoid bringing up subjects and not following up on them is Popenoe didn't stop with the 1930s. He kept on a busy little career writing marriage column stuff at the Ladies' Home Journal. And his views, which really were kind of oddly misogynistic, and women were supposed to be subordinate to their husbands, and there were all sorts of odd attitudes about this, and his kind of suspicion of feminism in general. Guess who was a follower of Popenoe? But James Dobson of the current conservative family council group. He was a follower of Popenoe and continued to follow through on it. Ideas do have consequences, but boy, I just don't think Dinesh ever bothered to look. And then he went farther down onto his next little footnote. He was quoting some more stuff on where he or cites the primary source directly, but did he really bother to read it too closely? He went off on Rudin, was a particularly nasty little character. Ernst Rudin was a big believer in eugenics and bettering the species. He was a German who did help grease the skids for the Nazis, and he kind of downplayed his Nazi pedigree on this. And Dinesh is trying to put guilt by association, because Sanger's Birth Control Review published an article on eugenic sterilization by Ernst Rudin, chief architect of the Nazi sterilization program and mentor of Joseph Mengele, although that was in the future. But the problem is that it was in an issue that was discussing the whole issue of sterilization procedures. And it presented a bunch of pros and cons about whether or not this was a good idea. That was one of the articles that was presented. Most of the articles there were generally in favor of sterilization, although one explicitly in that very issue was saying, no, it shouldn't be involuntary. That was not a good idea. Now, for Dinesh's not following through on his own subject matters has to do with why Rudin was such a jerk. There was a wonderful paper that I stumbled on by researching about Rudin. This took me all of like an hour. There was some really fascinating stuff from 2015. Some people who had looked at an unpublished paper that Rudin had done in the 1920s on manic depression. And it turned out that was the kind of scientist that only prints stuff that matches what they want to be true and ignore the parts that don't. Absolutely insistent had to be inheritable. and you could weed it out of the population through proper eugenics procedures. And he was getting information. He was applying all the new genetic laws and all the stuff that he was dealing. He was one of the pioneers in applying Mendelian genetics to looking at traits characteristics as much as they knew in the pre-DNA era. And he was accurate enough. That's one of the reasons why Rudin had the reputation that he had, because he was quite effective in the areas that he had studied before World War I. Depression, it turns out from this unpublished paper that turned up, depression wasn't fitting his model, and he didn't like that, so he just suppressed the data. And ironically, the numbers he was getting in his own research match up quite beautifully with what we now know about the environmental impact on manic depression, that it's not a simple genetic relationship. And so the data was literally under his own nose, and that this was an indication of what happens when somebody's overriding ideology overrides their scientific method, even if they do start out as rigorous scientists in many respects. And that, ironically, is putting a mirror up to what D'Souza, who relies on secondary sources, who has an intractable dogma and a demonization of people that he doesn't like, and a laudization and never criticize the people he does like. And so he's doing, in his own little tiny niche books, precisely what Rudin was getting wrong in his pseudoscience back in the 1920s and 30s. It was requiring only things to be true that you want to be true and ignoring evidence to the contrary. So this was the stuff with this latest install of Dinesh D'Souza. He's just addicted to this method. He can't get off of it. I have no respect whatsoever for him as a scholar, because every time I look at what he brings up, conclusion first, and then he scavenges around to whatever extent that he can to find material that reinforces it. And the fact that he was particularly nasty area, because this cuts to the core of the nature of the human mind and the nature of populations and ethics, and it gets simplified as a good guys are the anti-eugenicists and the bad guys were the eugenicists, and it was kind of simple. Nice, neat, good, and evil, because we know where it ended up with the Nazis. But the underlying it all reflected a lot of the bad science and the jumping to conclusion science, the 1920s and 30s, when they didn't really understand as much as they thought they did. Mixed in racism with that. Virtually every one of the people who were end of eugenics, all were bloody racists. And they didn't like Mexicans, they didn't like Jews, or they didn't like fill in the blanks. And they dressed up their prejudices in a little bit of Mendelian genetics, but only so long as it fit. And a lot of them looked on in terms of what the Germans were doing in terms of euthanasia and sterilization, which began in the pre-Hitler era. And a lot of people in the United States and in Europe tended to think that there were safeguards in place, that only the right people were being subjected to this. Sanger fell into that. There was a legitimate criticism, ironically, made about Sanger, overly willing to think that the Germans, with all of their court systems and protections, were being very, very careful about this. Oliver Wendell Holmes, in the famous Buck Bead Bell case, had made exactly the same mistake regarding Georgia, where they had their sterilization laws in place, and he was one of those that ruled in a now infamous ruling back, I think, about 1922 or so, that it was okay to do that. He was jumping to the conclusion that these states were really going to be paying careful care. They ended up basically wanting to sterilize black women. And that, of course, happened later in the 20s and 30s and 40s, when it ceased to be just feeble-minded, but then turned into basically racially based. And that's where ideas get out of control, when you start with something that starts out science and then gets more bad science, and then mixes in with politics, and then you get mixed in with people who suppress data that doesn't fit, and one thing leads to another. And the thing that Dinesh can't get through his nice Tortugan mind shell is that when he's looking at what is supposedly wrong with Margaret Sanger or Rudin or Popenoe, that culpa those characteristics. And problem, if there is a problem, everybody needs to correct the way they think about stuff. So I will pause for breath, Jackson, since I've been running on. That kind of sums up the core of everything.
Well, I'm sorry. Okay,
Offer a comment or reaction.
I just started looking through his tweets, and I don't really follow him closely, anyways. Usually, when I see him doing things, it's because he's popped up in a debate with someone or other who I do like. But so I looked at it, and I saw his book, The Big Lie, and it just, this whole area just seems insane. Just trying to link Nazism to the left, to the Democratic Party as a whole, is just absurd. This, of course, and you know, it kind of, or at least I thought, we should worry more about using the term Nazi when describing our enemies, because everyone was a Nazi. You know, if you disagreed with someone else, you're a Nazi. And then we realized, oh, there are still Nazis.
It really overly used. I'm old enough to remember when people would be calling Nixon, or for that matter George Bush too, fascist or Nazis, and I'm going, don't use the term. They've got lots of things, Nixon certainly, that could be highly criticized, but let's reserve the term to accurately describe what it is. In the same way that a lot of hyper-conservatives bandy around Marxist and communist in ways that are not at all appropriate. Things, and they carry baggage with them. You have to remember, Dinesh, these hobby horses for years. He was written a bunch of books where he's been lambasting Obama. Oh, he despises Obama and Hillary Clinton. Oh, if he doesn't have a little voodoo dolls at home where he sticks pins in them, I would be really surprised, because he has just that kind of mood about that. But he's been running amok in this mode for years, and you can never to offer any inroad criticism of it, because he just doesn't pay any attention. People have thrown, he's been making this claim about George Soros, that Soros was a Nazi collaborator, and this has been thoroughly debunked by a variety of people over the years, and he has taken out of context a particular interview where he repeats this, and he does it in this new book, the same thing. And when you lob this information at him, he just says, oh, there's the fake media, they're just repeating these claims and that. Well, excuse me, you haven't really documented that this was actually what you want it to be. And I know we, the Spanish Inquisition case and stuff before, and others, that Dinesh is a terrible scholar. He's an incredibly narrow-minded, credulous one. And his opposition to climate change, secondary sources, the same shtick. The problem is this has political ramifications, because when I do follow Dinesh, I have the masochistic desire to do this, he discusses and what he doesn't. And he's constantly having people praise him. That, oh, I just bought your new book, or I've seen your lecture on the Big Lie, and oh, we're going to tell all of our friends about it. So you've got a mass of people out there who are going to be soaking this material up. I toss in every once in a while on the tweet, did you fact check any of this? And then once in a while, a tiny number of them will say, well, what evidence do you have of that? And I will then offer evidence for it, where Dinesh has gotten his head up his ass, and they don't ever respond to that. And I can presume the little Tortugan mind shell is kicking in, and we're getting the deer in the headlight stuff.
It's too hard to respond.
And so what becomes historical scholarship turns into political diatribes as people try to make points on things. I've taken to calling Dinesh the Howard Zinn of the culture camp right, just to see if I can get him thin under his skin on that, because Howard Zinn is a not dissimilar case on the left-wing side, a more amiable personality as far as I could tell. He died, I think, a few years ago. He has a huge following among a lot of leftists. But with Dinesh, Howard Zinn has a political viewpoint. Left-wing relies an awful lot on secondary sources and not really looking closely to see whether or not his hypotheses are correct or not. And it doesn't mean that nothing is ever kind of true. Like there were Nazis during the Second World War, and there was the KKK, and there was Democrats who were anti-slavery, I mean pro-slavery, and all of that, which he makes a great deal about. He's trying to refight the Civil War too by putting all of the onus of iniquity purely on the side of the Democratic Party, which is an interesting leap that he takes, as though the Democratic Party stayed the same all the way down to the present. And he tries to make this argument that it was the Democrats who were the big opponents of civil rights in the 1960s, not the Republicans. The Republicans were actually for it. And for that, you had to look at the demographics. Is you had a time when the Republicans had liberals as well as conservatives, and the Democrats had liberals as well as conservatives. But the conservative wing of the Democratic Party was probably far more conservative than the conservative brand of the Republican Party at that time. And what it turned out is, if you looked at who was in the states of the former Confederacy, suddenly a different picture emerges. That outside of the Confederacy, Democrats were overwhelmingly for civil rights, and Republicans, but not quite as intense as Democrats. If you looked in the Confederacy part, Democrats, actually, there were more of them supporting civil rights in the old Confederacy than there were Republicans in the old Confederacy states. The fact that the conservatives in the South were very conservative, as were the conservative Democrats. And so when you looked at that mix, it didn't look quite so simple. But then again, when does Dinesh pay attention to actual numbers? So the idea that what is in issue, Margaret Sanger and birth control, and therefore Planned Parenthood, see the dominoes falling over, can't you? Well, Planned Parenthood, and that's the Democratic Party, and women's reproductive rights and lesbian, gay issues, and the American Civil Liberties Union, and then you've got the eugenics movement, and then oh, wait a minute, you got all these people over in the right wing with their anti-immigrant status and alt-right viewpoints, which Dinesh just doesn't want to acknowledge exists. Now, one final little capper on the eugenics thing. We'll have this running right about a half hour, which sounds about right. And I believe I pointed this out to Dinesh. I pointed it out to a few other people at the Discovery Institute, and nobody ever picked up on that one. And I put a posting up at hashtag tip, the tortugan.wordpress.com and at tortugan.com, where I went into this today. And it turns out there's really only one group that's kind of pushing it, and that's the Occidental Quarterly, which is a little magazine that's put out by one of the Regnieri brothers, who is one of the big pushers of intelligent design. They're culture camp conservatives. They're a hotbed. Who, by the way, also Dinesh D'Souza's books. So what an interesting little club we get into on all of these things. That's that ideas have consequences, and stupid
Absolutely.
is as stupid does.
Yeah,
I try to have a universal standard on things. So if somebody is a sloppy scholar, I don't care what their political persuasion is. If they do a bad argument, then it's a bad argument. But Dinesh, he's an ideologue. So good arguments are ones that say he want to be true, and bad arguments are one he do not want to be true. And that's the filter, not the technical scholarship.
Yeah, it just displays a fundamental lack of caring about the issues. If you're going to try to associate what modern Planned Parenthood is with the beliefs of the founder, because I mean, you go to a Planned Parenthood site, and they're obviously not going to tell you about eugenics. They're not going to tell you about who the superior races are or anything like that. That is just absurd. They are about women's health and also men's health, and so it's the ideological boogeyman. We don't like it, so we're going to throw everything together on it.
And there's a left-wing prejudice in this regard too, because just as right-wingers don't like the idea that environment can affect people's lives, left-wingers don't like the idea that genetics can affect people. And so you get a group that are ideologically opposed to any indication that anything ends up being inherited, and might be defining characteristics for different demographic groups. And so you get into a big mess on that. My friend Justin suggested that we should have a discussion about race as an evolutionary issue and whether or not race has any meaning in an evolutionary context, which in a way it doesn't.
Depends on what you mean
that's
by race.
a current. I'm going to do that as our. I told him I'd do that as the next evolution hour. That will be number 15, because that's a topical issue. Because functionally, a race is just a subset of a species, and in terms of humans, the amount of genetic differences between the races are relatively trivial compared to a lot of other species. And so it's just the kinds of things that people fight wars over and set up pogroms about are absolutely trivial genetically. And it's, in fact, our diversity is the fact that, we want to have more diversity, not less. But they can't seem to realize that. So the thing that was a big fighting words issue back in the 1920s and 30s, we look back on as like looking at phlogiston. It's just utterly antiquated, and it's oblivious in the modern sciences. Even as late as the 70s, some of these things were still kind of fighting issues in a way that they aren't now, primarily because we know the damn genetics. We can measure the haplotypes. You can see the dynamics of things on a scale of resolution that's completely miles away from what they were talking about then. And the sad thing is that anybody in the 30s thought that you could do such serious issues as sterilization. That's one of the reasons why that one critic in Margaret Sanger's old magazine there, that Dinesh didn't notice, was making that point out. It's the fact that it's irreversible. And if you're making a mistake, if you're getting the science a bit wrong, if you're getting a little bit of prejudice in the field, that upsets everything. Is that you shouldn't do things that you don't really understand well enough, or that would have irreversible consequences. You should be very leery of that. And I think we are much more.
I was interested when you said people on the left were against genetics influencing our behavior. Were you referring to the postmodernists?
Partly, but also just orthodox Marxian style ones get into trouble about this, and in particular in relation to gender issues. The idea that men and women are not genetically identical and have different dynamics that are going on. It doesn't mean that that's a justification or a reason for why demographically there were fewer women mathematicians, for example. And Jerry Coyne has often gone into this issue, no conservative he, at why evolution is true, that there's an awful lot of what he calls the regressive left. That just goes ballistic over a lot of this stuff. And you get a little bit of that in the kind of gender politics that's infested the Democratic Party over the last few years. And you get into it, particularly in relation to Islam, which is a separate issue, but it's the same cultural mindset of whether or not the aspects of Islam are wrong, and to criticize Islam is therefore to be Islamophobic. And, so there's baggage on both sides here.
Yeah, I've actually had conversations with other people along those lines.
Yeah, and so we're knee deep in it now. Historian, I'm going, yawn. We've been through this before. And I didn't think I would have to live through something like that, because I came too late, which was the whole bit in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s over the counterpart of this between the left and the right, where the left and the right were increasingly polarized, and you had doctrinal enclaves of fascists on one side and communists on the other, and then you have world wars and everything running around, and that's messy. And I was hoping that we'd kind of gotten past that, but no, as it turns out, the current circumstances have shown that a lot of these attitudes haven't gone away, and in part, dumb each time. They can inherit and accumulate dumb, or it's like static charge, where lint comes onto your socks, this can happen quite automatically. So we have to be learning how to guard against it. The tools to do that, but also so do the wingnuts, because they've got the YouTube like his. I bet Dinesh D'Souza's videos are seen way more than mine are. And so that's a factor. that we got to try to figure out what to work on, but that we got the facts on our side, and we have the evidence and the method. Use that. More people who really embrace it, source fact check. Don't take anything I say for granted. Check it out yourself. And in the process of following the trails and any other trails you go into, you can learn so much more than you did before. Stultifying about people both on the left and the right on these issues is that they don't learn anything. In pot shots, really curious enough to realize, wait a minute, there's all this stuff. Try to find out what the data set is, and it's way more interesting, and way more valid, because when you actually have the facts, you can make informed decisions about what's going to happen. I should just add, as a side detail, it shocked the daylights out of me that the guy that's just been headed to head NASA is a climate change denier and culture camp conservative, Beldenstein or something. He's an Oklahoma representative that popped up peripherally on my scope. And that's another example, boy, times, folks, and we're going to have to all work together and marshal reason and evidence and try to dampen down the extremists on both sides who are trying to fire everybody up and make everybody choose between two unpalatable extremes. We got to restage the middle.
Yeah, there's a lot of the us versus them mindset, and that needs to be eliminated, at least for the most part. But that happened to NASA is crazy. It's just with so much information that they churn out on the topic, you think this kind of thing wouldn't happen.
Well, but this is the one cautionary upside of Trumplandia is it's forcing us to reevaluate how our political system works, how our electoral process works, how lazy we have gotten in regards to people at the grassroots running for state legislatures and city councils and governorships, as well as the people in representatives, and that, because now has cascaded up. President of the United States that can appoint a nincompoop as the head of NASA, and yipes,
I mean,
that's going to have consequences for.
Yeah, you're right. It's like having Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education.
Yeah, I've been pointing out that this is the most an anti-science administration ever. Completely eclipses anything that you found in the Reagan years or the Bush years. There were occasional ones that you had quibbles about, but overall, they were kind of still floating close enough to the mainstream. This has suddenly jumped ship to a complete wackaloon world, where the outliers are the ones that aren't. There are a few of those. I feel on alternating Tuesdays, I feel terribly sorry for poor Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of the State, because he's got to deal with Trump, and I'm curious to see how long he lasts on it. But we're now in one of these stages where if you thought you could live in a little ivory bubble, worry about all this political stuff because it's kind of all on autopilot. Nope. And the methods that are the reason why Jaronist flat earthers believe what they do, or Holocaust deniers, or everybody but Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare's plays, or young earth creationism, or anti-vaxxers, we're dealing with the same bad core methodology. You can find a way of inoculating against that as a system to either get the educational system to nourish as much as possible of this in the general population, or at the least prevent people that you just can't reach because they're Tortugan minds from getting into political power. That's going to be a hard process. We'll never be able to eliminate it. There's going to be districts and stuff where you just won't be able to pull it off completely. But we have a way too high Tortugan in our political institutions, and it's going to be fasten the seatbelts for the next few years because it's going to be a bumpy ride.
We can only guess what our next election will be like.
Oh yeah, this is going to be an interesting one, and it's going to test our mettle. it's fair to say that the Democratic Party is in disarray. They've been relatively weak. It's been pointed out that, though, that there was not actually a groundswell of support for Trump. There was a very interesting post, and I put a link up to it on my Twitter feed and also on Facebook, because I thought it was so interesting, because they had gone through the states where Trump did the upset because of the Electoral College, and it wasn't because he got more votes than Mitt Romney did in 2012. It's because the Democratic voter turnout was low from former Obama voters, probably from
Which
a
is
lot
what
of
happened.
conservative black churches who were culturally much more in tune with the GOP, but voted for the first black president. No justification to do that. Plus, Hillary had an awful lot of baggage carrying around with it, and there we go. Although I would have taken Hillary and did vote for Hillary over Trump any day. But it's going to have to see what happens at this grassroots level. We'll see what happens in our local district here. There are several, we got 3 different people planning on running against Kathy McMorris Rogers, who's been fairly entrenched, although losing or winning at slightly smaller. But nevertheless, she still is a strong conservative candidate. She's kind of wishy-washy. She's pro-Trump, but she's very good at deflecting. And she's gotten into a bit of trouble, though, because of her health care are vague to the point of diaphanous, and she can't quite get pinned down on that, and she's gotten an awful lot of very testy town hall meetings on that. But anyway, if it should be the case that can be dislodged here in this district, which used to be Tom Foley's old thing, he was Speaker of the House for a while, that would be symptomatic that, boy, you've really got kind of a sea change on there. It's a tough row. The way that gerrymandering has been done by the Republicans, but also in general, has helped to sustain incumbents. Very difficult to dislodge incumbents in general. And so the kind of mix in the House requires 25, 30 seats, but tough to do. Senate's a little bit easier because that's full general thing, and the fact that the Democrats couldn't take the Senate in 2016 was very symptomatic of how weak they were. And so get it all, you got to get going on it. And ones who were voting for miscellaneous third-party candidates, and we've got a porpoise logo, atheist party of reason and all this kind of stuff. Well, yeah, but I'm not at all sure we're going to see a sea change like what happened between the Whigs falling apart after their failure to dislodge the Jacksonian Democrats, and then they kind of re-coalesced as the Republican Party over the slavery issue. That kind of thing is likely to happen. So, Eller, we're living in interesting times, he said with a terrified look on his face. Well, thank you for joining. I won't keep you too long out there because it's later on your end of the thing. We ran a little over a half hour. I wanted to have a kind of a foil to work off of for this discussion because I thought it was relevant. But anybody then who wants to follow up on this, they can look at the link and do some little. You can find the sources there, open access. You can follow the trail yourself. You learn an awful lot of stuff. And the more you do that on your own, the less liable you should be to just swallowing what people tell you are true. Even me, as fantastically accurate as I always have.
True, very true.
I try my best, and I'm perfectly capable of making mistakes. Everybody is. And unlike Dinesh D'Souza, I will even acknowledge it. But you learn from your mistakes. And if you recognize that you have made an error, then you have to backtrack and go, what was it? In fact, in chapter 5 of the old tip book, I mentioned a particular case where I jumped off of a bridge, scholarly wise, because I had 3 sources, but they were all secondary ones on a particular thing about the way hominid teeth were formed. I had a technical reader up at the University of Toronto that was looking through the work to fact check it, and she caught me on it. She said, nope, that's wrong. And I learned from it because I realized that I had been drawing on secondary sources, not primary sources. And a lot of the material that I would have been able to find easily now wasn't available then. So the one admonition I can take is around until you can find a primary source. If you can't find a primary source for it, up in your brain going, that means maybe there isn't on it. And that applies on virtually everything. There are things that pop up. I see television shows on or reports on where I'm trying to find the primary data on it. If I can't, doesn't mean it's instantly false, but it immediately has warning signs that you put up around it mentally.
I was actually in that position the other day. I was looking up a claim that an apologist made, saying that like an eternal universe couldn't exist because of thermodynamics. So I looked up eternal universe thermodynamics, couldn't find anything. So I actually asked Tony yesterday what his thoughts on that were, and he said, "Oh, it's bogus." Explain why.
Yeah, and I've gradually learned tools for Googling to try to maneuver around things. The first order of business, if you'll notice in my bibliography, I don't use URLs directly for the main website. I don't put the whole URL in because I go, it's a waste of time. If you ever clicked on something in a thing and it goes not available, 402 error or whatever, because the thing has been moved to a different website address and you're screwed. So I don't do that. I'd much rather put down what the title of it is. That's going to be retained no matter where it gets posted, because they very rarely ever change that. And of course, for technical articles and stuff, you have that fixed title. So you can start poking around and look to see not only original material, but you'll also start seeing people who have cited it because it's showing up in their reference listings. Find trails of subject matter that you wouldn't realize was there because you're looking for the title or the topic of the subject rather than the URL or something like that. So it weans you back from that, oh, easy click, up the thing you're clicking for, the thing you're searching for. And I found more fabulous material. All this material that I discovered about Rudin and that paper that he had suppressed only came up because I was fact-checking Rudin, rather than just simply going aside and going, well, he's a jerk. Well, yeah, there's Wikipedia was telling me that. But that I did some additional searching on things to find out where he was in other contexts, and kaboom, up comes something I wasn't looking for that actually improves my understanding of his bad science and also improves my understanding of why eugenics went off the rails in the 1920s and 30s, and therefore gives you direct lessons to avoid doing that today. Science du jour, where it's from climate change issues to vaccine and medical policy to space policy, weapons policies, gun registration issues. I mean, there's the same classification of things will be applied in a lot of different areas. Well, okay, here we are. See, I'm talking again. We've done about 45 minutes. Thank you for joining. I will actually be stopping for real. And then we'll get this on to the points where people can take a look at it. And everybody who thinks that Dinesh D'Souza is as big a jerk as I do, please let everybody know on that. And so that everybody in the world who doesn't like Dinesh D'Souza can be looking at our video here and will be edified by it. And then eventually Dinesh D'Souza will even maybe have to pay attention. Okay.
Alrighty.
Au revoir.
Bye.